Hi, I'm David Ulin, and I'm pleased to welcome you to the 2020 Brooklyn Book Festival for a reading and discussion with Brit Bennett and Tayari Jones. Before we begin, I want to let you know that books by authors in this program can be purchased in the link below. We're going to start with a brief reading by Brit and Tayari. First, I'm going to read their bios. And then after that reading, the three of us will have a conversation about their books and sort of whatever else comes up. I just want to say also that I'm delighted to be back at the Brooklyn Book Festival, which is one of my favorite book festivals. I'm just sorry that we're not all in some meeting room in Borough Hall or wandering the plaza and looking at the book stalls, and hopefully we can be back doing that next year. I'm delighted to be in conversation with these two writers, both of whom I admire very much. Brit Bennett is the author of The Mothers and The Vanishing Half, which was just longlisted for the National Book Award in Fiction. She earned her MFA in fiction at the University of Michigan, where she won a Hopwood Award, as well as a Hurston Wright Award for college writers. She's a National Book Foundation 5 Under 35 honoree, and her essays have been featured in The New Yorker, The New York Times Magazine, The Paris Review, and Jezebel. Tayari Jones is the author of 4 novels, including An American Marriage, which was also longlisted for the National Book Award in 2018. The novel is, in addition, an Oprah's Book Club selection, appeared on Barack Obama's reading list, and was awarded the Woman's Prize for Fiction. Jones has received the Hurston Wright Legacy Award and fellowships from United States Artists and the NEA. Her 3rd novel, Silver Sparrow, was added to the NEA Big Read Library of Classics in 2016. She's a graduate of Spelman College, the University of Iowa, and Arizona State University, and is Andrew D. White Professor at Large at Cornell University and the Charles Howard Candler Professor of Creative Writing at Emory University. So first, let me welcome both Brit and Tayari. Thank you so much for being here.
Thanks. Thanks for having us.
Brit, do you mind if we start with you for the reading portion of our event?
Sure. I will keep it very simple and just read the opening section of the book. So this is just the beginning of The Vanishing Half. The morning one of the lost twins returned to Mallard, Lou LeBon ran to the diner to break the news. And even now, many years later, everyone remembers the shock of sweaty Lou pushing through the glass doors, chest heaving, neckline darkened with his own effort. The barely awake customers clamored around him, 10 or so, although more would lie and say that they had been there too, if only to pretend that this once they'd witnessed something truly exciting. In that little farm town, nothing surprising ever happened, not since the Vignes twins had disappeared. But that morning in April 1968, on his way to work, Lou spotted Desiree Vignes walking along Partridge Road carrying a small leather suitcase. She looked exactly the same as when she'd left at 16, still light, her skin the color of sand, barely wet, her hipless body reminding him of a branch caught in a strong breeze. She was hurrying, her head bent, and Lou paused here, a bit of a showman. She was holding the hand of a girl, 7 or 8, in black as tar. Blue black, he said, like she'd flown direct from Africa. Lou's egg house splintered into a dozen different conversations. The line cook wondered if it had been Desiree after all, since Lou was turning 60 in May and still too vain to wear his eyeglasses. The waitress said that it had to be. Even a blind man could spot a Vignes girl, and it certainly couldn't have been that other one. The diners, abandoning grits and eggs on the counter, didn't care about that Vignes foolishness. Who on earth was the dark child? Could she possibly be Desiree's? Well, who else's could it be, Lou said. He grabbed a handful of napkins from the dispenser, dabbing his damp forehead. Maybe it's an orphan that got took in. I just don't see how nothing that black could have come out Desiree. Desiree seemed like the type to take in no orphan to you. Of course she didn't. She was a selfish girl. If they remembered anything about Desiree, it was that, and most didn't recall much more. The twins had been gone 14 years, nearly as long as anyone had ever known them. Vanished from bed after the Founders' Day dance, while their mother slept right down the hall. One morning, the twins crowded in front of their bathroom mirror, 4 identical girls fussing with their hair. The next, the bed was empty, the covers pulled back like any other day, taut when Stella made it, crumpled when Desiree did. The town spent all morning searching for them, calling their names to the woods, wondering stupidly if they had been taken. Their disappearance seemed as sudden as the rapture, Olive Mallard, the sinners left behind. Naturally, the truth was neither sinister nor mystical. The twins soon surfaced in New Orleans, selfish girls running from responsibility. They wouldn't stay away long. City living would tire them out. They'd run out of money and gall and come sniffling back to their mother's porch. But they never returned again. Instead, after a year, the twins scattered, their lives splitting as evenly as their shared egg. Stella became white, and Desiree married the darkest man she could find. Now she was back, Lord knows why, homesick maybe, missing her mother after all those years or wanting to flaunt that dark daughter of hers. In Mallard, nobody married dark. Nobody left either, but Desiree had already done that. Marrying a dark man and dragging his blue-black child all over town was one step too far. In Luzak House, the crowd dissolved, the line cook snapping on his hairnet, the waitress counting nickels on the table, men in coveralls gulping coffee before heading out to the refinery. Lou leaned against the smudged window, staring out at the road. He ought to call Adele Vignes. Didn't seem right for her to be ambushed by her own daughter, not after everything she'd already been through. Now Desiree and that dark child, Lord. He reached for the phone. You think they're fixing to stay? The line cook asked. Who knows? She sure seemed in a hurry, though, Lou said. Wonder what she hurrying to. Look right past me, didn't wave or nothing. Uppity. And what reason she got to be uppity? Lord, Lou said. I'd never seen a child that black before. I'll stop there.
Tayari, thank you very much, Britt. That was great. Tayari, would you want to read?
Okay, and thanks, Britt. That was really terrific.
Yeah.
I'm just going to read a little bit from the start of An American Marriage. This is from the point of view of Celestial on the day her husband is tried for a crime he did not commit. What I know now is this: they didn't believe me. 12 people, and not one of them took me at my word. There in the front of the room, I explained that Roy couldn't have raped the woman in room 206 because we had been together. I told them about the magic fingers that wouldn't work, about the movie that played on the snowy television. The prosecutor asked me what we had been fighting about. Rattled, I looked to Roy and to both our mothers. Banks objected, so I didn't have to answer, but the pause made it appear that I was concealing something rotten at the pit of our very young marriage. Even before I stepped down from the witness stand, I knew that I had failed him. Maybe I wasn't appealing enough, not dramatic enough, too, not from around here. Who knows? Uncle Banks, coaching me, had said, now is not the time to be articulate. Now is the time to give it up. No filter, all heart. No matter what you're asked, what you want the jury to see is why you married him. I tried, but I didn't know how to be anything other than well-spoken in front of strangers. I wish I could have brought a selection of my art, the Man Moving series, all images of Roy. I would say, this is who he is to me. Isn't he beautiful? Isn't he gentle? But all I had were words, which are light and flimsy as air. As I took my seat, not even the Black lady juror would look at me. It turns out that I watched too much television. I was expecting a scientist to come and testify about DNA. I was waiting for a pair of handsome detectives to burst into the courtroom at the last minute, whispering something urgent. Everyone would see that this was a big mistake, a major misunderstanding. We would all be shaken but appeased. I fully believed that I would leave the courtroom with my husband beside me. Secure in our home, we would tell people how no Black man was really safe in America. But 12 years is what they gave him. We would be 43 when he was released. Roy understood that 12 years was an eternity because he sobbed right there at the defendant's table. His knees gave way and he fell into his chair. The judge paused and demanded that Roy bear this news on his feet. He stood again and cried, not like a baby, but in a way that only a grown man can cry. As Roy howled, my fingers kept worrying a patch of skin beneath my chin, a souvenir of scar tissue. When they did what I remember as kicking in the door, what everyone else remembers as opening it with the key, after the door was open, however it was open, we were both pulled from the bed. They dragged Roy into the parking lot and I followed, lunging for him, wearing nothing but a white slip. My chin hit the pavement as my slip rode up, showing everything to everyone. Roy was on the asphalt beside me, barely beyond my grasp, speaking words that didn't reach my ears. I don't know how long we lay there, parallel like burial plots. Husband, wife, what God has brought together, let no man tear asunder.
Thanks, Tayari. It was great. All right, let's move into the conversation part. I want to start with a question that I think applies to both books, and it's actually the very first sentence of An American Marriage, written from the perspective of Roy. He says, or you write, or both, it begins the book, there are two kinds of people in the world, those who leave home and those who don't. And as I was thinking about this discussion, it seemed to me that that was a good place to start because it applies to my mind to both of your books. And so I was wondering if we can just start by talking about that idea, and then maybe talk a bit about how these narratives kind of grow a little bit out of that idea. It feels to me that these books are both in a fundamental way about the concept and the question of home and how we carry it with us or move from it or can't escape it, or the kind of weight of its influence. So, Tayari, since it's a quote from your book, why don't I start with you? But can you talk about that a bit?
Yeah, thank you. And also both the books are set in Louisiana.
Uh-huh.
Although mine is set in northern Louisiana, which is like almost like a whole different Louisiana than southern Louisiana. I do believe that I used to believe there are two kinds of people, those who leave home and those who don't. But now that I have come back home after 20 years away, I think there's a third kind of people, those who come back. And I think that's also true in Brit's book. But how tethered you are to where you started from does speak a lot to your personality. And although in my book, Roy says home is not where you land, is where you launch. Where you land is significant. Like Roy wants more than his small town Louisiana life could give him. So he moves to Atlanta, but he constantly feels himself to be a Louisiana boy in Atlanta. Just like in my own life, I lived in New York for 10 years and I always felt like a transplanted Georgia peach. I never thought I was a New Yorker. Even once I learned the subways, I always felt like I was a visitor there. I felt like everyone could look at me and see that I wasn't a New Yorker. And I think this is true. Like we carry our home with us for better or for worse. Sometimes your home can be grounding to you, to remember, as people say, always remember where you came from. But some people, I think, could benefit from forgetting where they came from. I think it really depends.
Yeah, I definitely agree with all of that. I think for me, really this town was kind of my entry point to the book. It was this idea of this town of very color-struck people, and what it would be like to grow up in a town like that and leave, and what it would be like to return to a town like that after you had been out sort of in the larger world. So I think that was really my entry point to the book. And to the last point that you just made, I think that's 100% true as far as how I thought about this book. I thought of home as something that's kind of mobile, that's not really a place, but that's something that people carry inside of them. And in the case of some of these characters, they're desperately trying to escape this place. Even though they leave this town, it continues to haunt them in a way, and it continues to pull them back in ways that they don't expect. And to me, there was always something that felt kind of honest about that idea, but also particularly interesting in the context of the hometown in my book being this place that's pretty insidious, I guess I would say, as far as their ideologies about skin color.
It's interesting because another hometown in the book, and I have to ask this as someone who lives in that town, is Los Angeles. And I think, the book kind of sneakily becomes a really great Los Angeles novel. And so I'm curious if we can carry the hometown thing a little bit further. I'm curious about your sense of that part of the book, of setting that material in Los Angeles, and kind of Los Angeles as that kind of social and literary landscape.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's a hybrid book in the way that sort of my family is kind of hybrid in that way. My mom is from Louisiana, my dad is from Los Angeles. So I think there was a sort of a way of marrying kind of both strands of my family, and thinking about that and that kind of migration from the South to the West Coast, instead of thinking of people going to northern cities in the way that I think we often do as far as the Great Migration goes. So I think that there was a way in which that was kind of something that I enjoyed thinking about, those different strands of where my family comes from. But beyond that, I think, this book also crept up on me as kind of a California novel, in the sense of playing into, I think, a lot of the mythology of the West, and the idea of the West as this place where you go to reinvent yourself, and particularly that, this idea of Los Angeles being a city of make-believe, a city of pretense. in a city of reinvention in that way. So there was something that became sort of increasingly apparent to me as I was thinking of where these characters were going to go and sort of reconnect, that Los Angeles felt like both the place where someone might go to reinvent themselves, but also a place in which you could conceivably kind of brush up against somebody who has this really insane connection to you and then just kind of never see them again. They just sort of would vanish off into the sprawling city. So I think it lent itself to me in ways that were both thematic and logistically helpful.
Yeah, and it exists. I mean, and it creates a really powerful contrast, I think, between exactly what you're saying, that sort of amorphous, sprawling anonymity in a sense of the big city, and then that kind of social density of the small town. Tayari, in American Marriage, Atlanta plays some of that role. A lot of the book doesn't. It's a different balance, but again, we have that tension or that balance between the home place and then this other, bigger, more anonymous place to which people go. And the distinction is really clear. I think about particularly in the latter part of the book with Andre driving up to Louisiana while Roy is on his way down to Atlanta, and the sense that just in that space of geography, we see all those misconnections.
Well, first I have to ask Brit, where in Louisiana is your family from? My daddy is from Louisiana, and that's kind of why I have my book split.
Yeah. My mom grew up in Palmetto.
Where is that? What's that nearby to?
Oh, that's a good question. I think it's kind of near Opelousas,
Yeah.
but yeah, she grew up there, and her family now, they live in Westlake, around Lake Charles area. That's where her family now lives. But my mom and her sister, they were the only two to leave the South. Everybody else stayed in Louisiana and Texas, and we were always kind of just the weird California branch of the family.
And see, my daddy grew up in a small town called Oakdale, which is kind of near Baton Rouge, and so he moved to Atlanta because Atlanta was seen, as the promised land, because they had Black mayor, Black police chief, like that was this. So it was also a kind of migration. I do agree with you that the Great Migration, it seems like Black people going to Detroit.
Right.
Like that's what people think it is, but people disperse in a lot of ways to find this effort at a better life. I feel in some ways that An American Marriage is almost like an immigrant novel, because I feel like my daddy was an immigrant to Atlanta, even though he only came 4 states over, and that he had children in Louisiana before he met my mother. And I feel like his Atlanta children, are his children of the new country, and my sisters are his children of the old country, and they can cook the way his mother cooked, and almost like an actual immigration.
Right.
And we're his mysterious children from this new world that he loves us, but we're a little confusing.
That's a really interesting point. I wonder if you both can talk about kind of the role of cities in some sense. I mean, I really like this idea of sort of immigration, but that notion of cities and the potential promise they offer, because obviously once you get there, it's a lot more complicated than it looks. But it's a factor that runs through both novels, this notion of the city as a sort of place to get to, as a place where you can somehow be yourself. So I wonder if your thoughts on that as a kind of either just socially, but also in terms of how the fiction works.
Yeah. Well, I mean, I never want to sort of over romanticize cities, or even that the idea, I think for me, cities are interesting as far as places where characters are able to start over in a really different way. And I think, there's an earlier point in my book where they go to New Orleans, and there's sort of that similar feeling of, and a lot of that was kind of, I mean, I just love New Orleans. It's one of my favorite cities in the world. But beyond that, it was sort of these stories I heard from my mother growing up, which was the experience of like, that was the big scary city. Like that was when she was a child and a teenager, her mother was like, don't go there. Nothing good will happen if you go there. And that kind of feeling, that sort of is one kind of a way, I guess we think about cities as, they pose danger and there's risk, and that feeling that she had growing up. Versus the idea of cities being these places, which in the case of one of the characters in the book, Jude, when she goes to Los Angeles, it really is the space for her to start over, and not only just start over, but also to find community. I think that cities can be places where you find your people, and you find family, and you find this chosen family and this friendship, and she falls in love when she leaves her small hometown and finds herself in this larger city. So I do love that kind of duality of cities in the way of that there's something, you know, particularly risky about them, or there's a way of thinking that there's risk or there's danger, but there's also such potential for renewal and sort of creation of a different life that you may not have known was available to you.
And narratively, small towns, it's kind of like a small town the author had. You can make the small town any way you want, right? You give it a fictional name and you just have at it. You can make it, you know, famous for the pumpkin patch. Who knows? You have a lot more creativity, but each city is known for something specific. And so if you set something in Atlanta, you set in Los Angeles, even if you set it in Pittsburgh, there's a certain expectation the reader will have with what that particular city means. I think we kind of think of small town America as the site of provincialness and quirkiness, and you can do whatever you want to with those things. So the city becomes a little bit more reportage in your writing than I think the short story. Than the small town. I don't know where my brain got that from. Probably because I'm grading papers, but really, I think that the city. One thing I did in American Marriage is that I tried to give the small town a fair shake as just a different place to live, not necessarily a better or worse place. Because people who live in small towns get really tired of people in cities looking at them like, oh, you poor you live in a small town. There are people who choose small town life, and not necessarily in a romantic way. Some people just like being around people they know. And the idea that the people you know are somehow inferior to the people you have yet to meet in a city. So I really wanted to kind of balance that. And I wanted also to have Roy find just a kind of grounding in who he is, but not in a sentimental way in the small town, that you don't have to run away from who you are to be who you can be.
Mm-hmm. It's interesting because one of the things cities bring out, and I don't want to belabor the city point, but is a kind of boldness, I think, in certain characters. And boldness is something that happens throughout both books. Tayari, you have a line. No, wait, I'm missing that. Well, I'll come back to that. But the idea of characters kind of stepping outside of themselves in some way, it begins with them leaving, right? So, for instance, in The Vanishing Half, when Desiree and Stella, leave, it's a catalyst. But people are leaving or shedding things throughout, right? Jude does when she goes to Los Angeles. Reese is another example. And in American Marriage, we see what we expect to happen, right? Which is, the traditional narrative would be the sort of, the marriage stays together or wrestles through the difficulty. But in fact, as you mentioned, I think in the essay in the paperback, the book club edition, it's a trial for both of them. It's 5 years for both of them. And so the way the book kind of explores that, each of those characters is behaving in a kind of bold way or having to kind of step outside of their own expected behavior. And it feels to me like that can't really happen so much in the small town. The small town is where you go back to, as Roy does or as Desiree does. But in order to kind of assert that boldness, it's got to be a place you move away from, at least for a while. I'm curious about.
No, I believe the late great Fannie Lou Hamer would beg to differ. I believe Medgar Evers would beg to differ. People get a lot done in small towns. I think in stories, mm-hmm. that the way narration works, that people leave. But just think, within a small town, you could join a different church and scandalize everybody. It's all a matter of where you think the boundaries are.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I agree with that. I think also for myself, when I thought about Desiree returning to this small town, it was important to me that she has a full life there, that she does not necessarily go on to do the things maybe that she thought she would do when she was young, but she falls in love, and that she has this close relationship with her mother that Stella doesn't have. She does work that she's good at. To me, all of those things were really important, because I think there can be a tendency, and I'm somebody who's, bounced from kind of city to city, at least in recent years. There is a tendency to really romanticize that experience of what it means to be in a city. But to me, it was important to show her that she returns to her hometown, which is a place she never wanted to return to, but she has a full and complex life there.
And
Yeah.
even in big cities, don't you feel like when you live in a big city, you live in a part of a city? Like
Sure.
when I lived in Brooklyn, I really much kind of lived just right over there.
Right.
I didn't go up in Queens and stuff. I don't know what's going on over there.
Right. Right.
And even here in Atlanta, I mean, I moved 20 minutes from my parents and they act like they need a passport and a visa to go. They're like, I would have come over, but I didn't have gas. I didn't have a car. And then by the time your mama made lunch, it was just too far, and we live in a really big city.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah, I noticed that when I was living in Las Vegas, I would meet these people who lived in Henderson or someplace, and it would be like an expedition. I'd say,
Yeah.
"Let's have dinner somewhere," and it was, the logistics of
Yes.
getting the
Yes.
20 miles from one place to the other was kind of overwhelming. Tayari, you also talk in that essay about kind of the genesis of the idea of the novel, and I'm curious about that genesis point. You mentioned that you had wanted to write an essay, write a novel. Now I'm doing it.
That's exactly. I was writing a novel that was turning into an essay about injustice. Because the thing about a novel is that a novel, for it to be interesting and to make you turn pages, it needs moral ambiguity.
Mm-hmm.
But when I was writing about wrongful conviction, there's no moral ambiguity. They call it wrongful because it's wrong. It's nothing else to say. So I had to find an angle where there was something to say and something that would keep me engaged for the 5 or 6 years I needed to write the book. And the question was, for me, this idea of expectations of marriage and this idea that once you face a racial injustice, everyone turns into a hero. That you are no longer facing a racial injustice makes it where you no longer have individual desires, where you're supposed to be endlessly sacrificing, and that just doesn't work for real people. Like people want to reserve the right to be people, so that if a racial injustice makes it where you can't be a person, you have to be a saint, that is when the racial injustice has stripped you of your humanity, because it stripped you of your complexity.
Yeah, I think that's exactly right. And you said that in order to get at that, first of all, you had that moment where you saw that couple having that kind of argument or discussion.
It was an argument.
It was an argument publicly, and in fact, some of that dialogue almost made it verbatim into the novel. So like that dramatic moment became a kind of trigger for thinking about how to imagine it dramatically. You also mentioned that you had written it in first in Celestial's voice and then in Roy's voice before you began to think about the weave of voices, and I'm curious about how that developed in terms of the imaginative process of framing the book.
Well, I wrote the whole book from the point of view of Celestial, a woman whose husband was wrongfully imprisoned, because I was really interested in that, and I'm interested in women's lives. And everyone kept harassing me, saying, "What about her husband? What's her husband doing? What about?" And I got really defensive because I have a lot of men friends who are writers, and no one has ever told them they need to rewrite the book from the point of view of the woman. Never happens. So I kept pushing for her point of view. And then I decided to go ahead and give his point of view a chance, because when you're a writer, if you're a painter, let's say you're a painter and you edit your painting, you can never have the original back because you've changed it forever. But as a writer, you still have your other draft. The only thing that's stopping you from trying to take people's suggestions is your pride. So I said, okay. So I wrote his point of view, and it came to me like that because it was a familiar story. A man against the system. All he wants is to come home and find a faithful woman and a clean house. Like, that's the Odyssey. And that's why I could write it so quickly. But I wanted to write something new. I wasn't interested in just filing another story into that genre. And so that's when I decided to toggle their points of view. And then I felt I had something new, because we have never really heard, well, I won't say we have never, but it's seldom that you hear the woman speak frankly about what it is when you're supposed to be this monument of chastity in opposition to a man's suffering.
Yeah, I think that's an excellent point. And that to me is one of the great strengths of the novel, is that interplay of voices. We see the kind of, in a way, the mutual frustration. And we know as adults that there's no simple solution to this problem. And that in fact becomes the power of the novel. It doesn't try to clean up loose ends or tie up too neatly, or present anybody as a hero. They're all, three-dimensional living human beings. Brit, the same is true with your book. I think one of the most interesting structural things that you do is how, you introduce a new character out of a previous chapter. We get a hint or a glimpse of somebody, and then all of a sudden we get that, in the next chapter, we get that character's story. We have that happen with Reese. We have that happen with Kennedy, again and again throughout the book. I'm curious too about that notion of the enlarging quality of the structure, the enlarging quality of the style of the novel. Did you know you were going to do that from the beginning, or did that emerge through? I know you didn't, but
I'm sorry for laughing. I'm like, I wish I had known.
No, I know. How did that develop? Where did you start, and how did that develop?
Well, actually, and I'm not saying this because we're on this panel together, but a book that I thought about a lot was actually Silver Sparrow. And originally, that's what I thought. I was like, oh, I've got these two sisters. I'm going to do part of the book from Stella. I'm going to do part of the book from Desiree. And I just remember the emotional experience of reading that book. And once we sort of flipped perspectives, feeling like that book just cracked itself wide open. So I kept thinking that was what I was going to do. And then as I started writing and I was starting to figure out when you were going to sort of catch up with Stella again, I just felt all of these other characters just sort of encroaching on me. And I started to think about Jude, because Jude is the little girl that you meet in the opening pages of the book. You know that it's going to be really awful for her growing up in this town. So I started to think, okay, well, what's her life like? And then once I started getting into Jude, I started to think about Stella's daughter, who grows up under entirely different circumstances, and what's her life like? And then eventually some of these male characters that you just described kind of pushed their way in on the book. So it became something really different than what I had imagined. And in a lot of ways, it became extremely messy. It became just me trying to navigate kind of this series of what felt like at the time problems that I just created for myself. Because to me, the structure in my mind that would have made the most sense would have been just focusing on those twin sisters. But, for whatever reason, these other characters really sort of drew me in and made me really interested in their lives and how they were kind of interweaving. So a lot of writing the book just became me trying to kind of balance and juggle all of these different characters, so that it didn't take away from the twins, but it kind of supported and enriched that main storyline. But I did not expect any of that, and made life probably way harder for myself. But I'm glad I had fun writing these other points of view and thinking about these other characters that are a little bit more tangentially related to the story.
Was there ever a thought in your head of writing it in a way similar to American Marriage, of writing it as a series of overlapping first-person narratives as well as opposed to a series of overlapping third-person narratives?
I am not a great writer in the first person, to be honest. I find it very difficult. I find it a lot harder than third person. And the only section I will say that I wrote from the first person originally was Kennedy. And a lot of that was just me trying to kind of figure out her voice. I think part of it is because she is kind of the outlier character. Like, she is more different than any of the other characters in the book. She grows up as socialized as a rich white child. And there was something so different about her. And so kind of a lot of, I think, to me was about sort of hearing her voice and her kind of relentlessly churning, sort of nonstop chatty voice. I wrote that in the first person, and then kind of went back and forth. Did I want that to be actually different than the third person of the book? And ultimately decided to write that in the third person to kind of keep that continuity. So I didn't seriously think about that. I think a lot of that is just about my sort of inability to write in the first person in a way that feels, I don't know, I like hiding in fiction, and I think even writing fiction in the first person makes me feel more exposed, even though I'm not writing actually as myself.
Yeah, I think that's a really interesting point. And Kennedy's a fascinating character in the book because she's unpredictable. I mean, I have a certain judgment about her when I first meet her, which at first seems to be sustained, but then it gets turned around, and she turns out to be a much more complicated, interesting character than I thought she was. The same happens with Roy and Celestial and Andre in American Marriage. So I'm curious, for you both as writers, as creators, what are the things that surprised you? I mean, obviously the act of writing anything, and certainly a novel, is an act of discovery first for the writer, but you have to have some sense of, you know, where you're starting or what you're looking for. What surprised each of you about the characters, about the narrative, about the process of writing, about what emerged on the page?
Plot twists always shock me. They shock me. Like when Roy discovers, whenever I feel like I use the word true identity, I feel like there should be like some background music, like dun dun dun. When he discovers the true identity of his cellmate, Roy was shocked. I was shocked. We were shocked. I got up and I walked out of the room. And for me, that's what makes a story fun. I feel that if I know where a story's going, you'll feel me aiming for it. You'll feel me setting it up, and it won't surprise you because I don't have a poker face. So if I know it, I'm going to tell you early or show you early. So that, and I like to feel the anxiety writing the next page as I want you to feel turning the next page. We're in it together in that way.
Brit?
Yeah, I love that. I think lots of this book surprised me. I think, you know, to your comments on Kennedy, she was certainly, I think, probably the character who surprised me the most. I think she's someone who's very easy to dismiss, and I was very dismissive of her at first. Someone referred to her as a Brentwood brat, and that phrase just kind of loops around my head when I think about her. And, you know, I think originally I was very dismissive of her, but I think once I started to think about what her relationship with her mother looks like from her point of view, which is, I want to be close to my mother, but my mother keeps pushing me away and I don't understand why. That was when she became a much more sympathetic character to me. And, you know, the question was sort of, you know, if you learn something really surprising about yourself, how does that change how you think about yourself? Does it change it at all? Do you just sort of continue on in the way that you've always conceived of yourself? That became a really interesting question, and thinking, well, how is Kennedy going to actually react to this really surprising information about her family lineage and her heritage? So she was someone who surprised me a lot, frustrated me a lot, I think, in the way a lot of these characters did. But I had fun writing as this character, or about this character who is very different than myself.
I mean, the way she kind of cracks the book open and sort of, I mean, just the sense of, I don't know what else to call it, but the sense of kind of diaspora in the book. And I think that, you know, that reminds me of something that I think Roy says in your book, Tayari, about being 2.0. And the difference of, which is just a brilliant way of phrasing it. And I want to talk a little bit about that idea, about the way that, you know, I don't know how to put it, like social condition, opportunity, et cetera, whether financial or otherwise, it changes things and it doesn't change other things. But the landscape is less clear in good ways and also difficult ways. I wonder if we can talk a little bit about that notion, because one of the things both of these books seem to be talking to me about is the complexity of identity. And I'm curious about your thoughts on that.
Well, I think the generational jump is never as big as the generation you're in wants it to be. And the generation you're not, your parents' generation sees the jump as a gulf. Mm-hmm. But like Roy wants more. He wants them to be, Black people 2.0. And he says, you know, Celestial grew up being, you have to try twice as hard to get half as much. And they feel like, why would you tell that to a child? That's such a distressing thing to tell and to believe. But then they find out that even in their own marriage, you know, being married is not that deep. Lots of people are married. People are married all over the world. You know, randos are married. But for them, as Black people in America, when he is wrongfully imprisoned, what it would take for them to be married is more than twice as hard for half as much. They would have to be like, it would be a Herculean effort just to be married. So they find out that they haven't escaped this double standard of effort to result that their parents always warn them about. Like, it's really frustrating when you think that you have progress and the progress isn't, progress has been made. I mean, Roy and Celestial live a more materially comfortable life than their parents did, but the progress wasn't enough to keep him out of prison.
Yeah, no, I think that's a really important point. It reminds me of a line from The Vanishing Half when in a chapter dealing with Reese, where he thinks or reflects, to be honest about the past meant that he'd be considered a liar. And so it's, we think about that notion of, okay, if we can just keep the heritage straight and tell the stories of who we are, we'll know who we are or who we are becoming. But it's so much more complicated than that. So, Britt, I'm wondering if you want to jump in on that question.
Yeah, I mean, I think that question was a lot of what drew me to this book. Was sort of thinking about the complexity of identity and the idea that we ever have really a straightforward way of even telling the stories of our own lives. I think to, go back to Kennedy a little bit, to me, I kept writing her, I kept thinking about these stories that you'll read about of people who believe themselves to be one race and then will do, 23andMe DNA tests and find out their racial background is something completely different than what they have always believed it to be. And there's some people who react to that by, going through sort of some existential crisis and completely reevaluating their lives. There are other people who completely ignore it and sort of continue on in the way that they've always believed their background to be. So I was so kind of interested in that question of somebody like Kennedy, who always believed yourself to be a white person. You learn that your mother is Black. What does that change about your life, if anything? And I think even talking about that character, I've sort of struggled with how to even define her, to be honest, because there are some people, there are some readers that will describe Kennedy as Black. There's some readers that will describe her as white. I had one person I was talking to who described her as functionally white with Black heritage. So I think that all of that complexity of even describing this character is to me, speaks to a lot of these questions that I was interested in writing this book. The way that complexity, the sort of complexity of identity, it far exceeds our language and far exceeds the familiarity of language that we have. And yet it is something that we try to boil down in a lot of very simple ways of describing it and telling stories about it. To me, it was something about that tension between those ideas that I found really, really difficult in thinking about, but also really interesting in writing about.
I have a question I'm just all jumping in. I have a question. I was thinking a lot about passing today. Have you ever had the experience where you saw someone, you immediately thought they were a Black person? You greeted them Black person to Black person? I've had more than one situation where I had no idea this person was supposed to not be Black. I was like, I did not mean to blow up your spot. I thought, and I thought that I've been dying to talk to you about this, that part of the ways that people are able to what we call pass is that in a racist society, people believe that Black people are so othered that if a person is not Black in a way that is really, really obvious, they think, well, it never occurs to them that this person would be Black, because after all, they seem so human. But as another Black person that's used to, particularly as a Black Southern person, that's used to such a range of Blackness. Yeah, this has happened to me like 3 times in the last 5 years that I've accidentally rolled up on somebody that was passing. I'm so embarrassed. Sorry.
Yeah, I mean, I think that that's all true. I think, one of the really funny reactions that I get to this book is people always white people who are just like, but how is this possible? Like they sort of take issues with almost the logistics or the idea, like that is like the part that they can't wrap their minds around. And, I think, my mom grew up, in Louisiana, where she was considered the dark person in her family. And my mother is much lighter than I am, not white passing, but much lighter. But she was, the sort of scorned dark person in her family for that reason. But I think being familiar with, my mom's sister has red hair and, pale skin, like she could pass. Being familiar with those ranges as we are in our community, the fact that this is something that is sort of unimaginable for some white readers has been, I guess in a way a little surprising to me. I just don't know that I don't know that I knew passing was this unfamiliar within sort of white readers. I thought this was something that we all kind of knew, but I think that has been, I think one of the most surprising things to me is people who, and I think that that's also what I was interested in the book, of I think what you said is true of sort of this idea of spying humanity or not spying humanity. But I also think that there is an arrogance that is that standpoint from within whiteness, which is that I can, if I'm going to determine the sort of racial order, that means that I can identify the racial order. And the idea that there may be people that you cannot identify in this easy way in establishing this racial hierarchy, that threatens the racial hierarchy itself. Like that threatens to topple that sentence. So if you cannot actually spot who belongs in which place in the hierarchy, and I think that there's sort of arrogance that comes from that standpoint of being like, how could this character pass? I would, this sort of white readers who are like, I would be able to know. There's something that's really funny about that to me, but I think also kind of speaks to this presumption within whiteness itself.
And also, like,
okay,
sorry, go ahead.
No, stop, because as you can
go
on about this forever. Well, okay, I'll just pop in one other thing. And then there's also the class incentive for passing. I mean, just like even in Nella Larson's passing, when you choose to pass, you're starting over from ground zero because you have no family, no connections. So you have to be a person who was able to have this phenotypic whiteness without the material things that tend to come along with it to make it make sense for you to start over from nothing. So if you're from an elite Black family that is light enough to pass, but everyone knows your father is a banker or a doctor or this and that, it would cost you to pass because you would have to go from being an elite person in a Black community to being a random person with no family connections, no nothing in a white community. So why would you do that? So I think that's also a piece. It's not just a desire for whiteness. Mm-hmm. It's about access. Mm-hmm. And you have to not have it.
And I think, I mean, it also in the books anyway, and I think in general, it puts a burden on, in Brit's book, Stella is carrying around an enormous weight. First of all, the weight of potential exposure, but it also kind of infects her in some sense in terms of her own response to issues of race, or for instance, without giving too much away, I think it's early enough in the book when the Black family moves on into the neighborhood and onto the street. She is initially the most vehement opponent because she has that territory that she feels she has to protect, and that I wonder, we're just about out of time, but I wonder if we can just address that question a little bit as sort of the last last question before we move on.
Yeah. Well, I mean, I also just really agreed with that last point, that at least for me thinking about this book, it wasn't about the desire for whiteness. I think that to me is the least interesting reason somebody might pass. And to me, in thinking about Stella, I kept thinking about what would cause her to risk what she risks and to give up what she loses. Because she's not someone who comes from wealth or any type of access. She's someone who really comes from nothing. And she is somebody who also has experienced and witnessed this violence growing up. And there's a way in which, to me, the way of thinking about the character was just what she's kind of running away from. It was thinking about that more than sort of even what whiteness provides her, which eventually does provide her with access and money and privilege and wealth and all of those things and power. But really thinking about what she was kind of running away from, and that would cause her to completely separate from her family. To me, the thing about this book was thinking about these characters that are in pursuit of lightness for its own sake and not lightness for any type of tangible reward. These are not rich people. These are not people who have access through pursuing their light skin. But even in spite of this pursuit, they're still experiencing racism. They're still, Stella's mother cleans houses for a living, even though she's really, really light. It doesn't buy her out of this discrimination and the prejudice that they experience. So I wanted to think about Stella not desiring whiteness even, but just desiring this way out and desiring this chance to reinvent herself in a way that causes her to really lose everything that ever meant anything to her.
Well, thank you both so much. This has been a great way to start my Monday, and I'm really pleased to have had this conversation. And thank you for taking the time. I do want to let all of you watching know that you can order books by both Brit and Tayari in the link below. And I also want to ask you all to please consider making a donation to the Brooklyn Book Festival, which is celebrating its 15th year of presenting free literary programming. It's a great festival, a really great community, and your support would be much appreciated. Thank you, Tayari. Thank you, Brit. Just a delight talking to both of you this morning. Take care.
Thanks.
Thank you so much.